So welcome to our second public seminar of the year, 2 per term. I'm very, very pleased to welcome Professor Becky Francis tonight. So I've known Becky for a number of years. We had sort of London connection. You were at Roehampton for a while when I was at Wandsworth, which is kind of adjacent parts of London. But I'll give a quick potted history, I guess. You did your BA in English, and then did your PhD in women's studies, and you kind of focused on gender and achievement and did some actually still quite groundbreaking work on that area. But then you became more interested in wider issues of social justice, and you were a professor at Roehampton, and then you were director of education at the RSA, the Royal Society for Arts, and then to a professorship in social justice at King's College London. And then you took on the massive task of managing the UCL Institute of Education, for which I think...
impossible task.
Impossible task, I should say. And then, just almost 4 years ago, you moved to take over the CEO role at the Education Endowment Foundation. And also, obviously, in that capacity that we're really particularly interested in inviting here tonight. So, I won't say any more. I'll just hand over to you, and we're going to have about 45 minutes for questions and for a presentation, followed by about half an hour for questions. So, thank you.
That's lovely, Steve. Thanks so much. Thanks for the generous introduction. And I don't really want to talk for 45 minutes if I can help it. So maybe if I'm still going on at about 40 minutes, you can give me a quick, because what I want is time for discussion and questions. And I'm really keen actually to hear from you. One of the things that I want to do is, as well as introducing the work of the EEF to the few of you that don't know about us, and talking a little bit about our learning and sort of developments over the last decade or so, I'm particularly keen to get your thoughts and your reactions to how we work with academia and our sort of partnership with education academia, what that feels like, and how we can be working more powerfully together. So that's the bit that I'm really keen to get to and to hear from you about. And to that end, I'll also be sharing a little bit about our strategic developments and some of our new work as well. But yes, let's get to that and make sure we've got that time for discussion. So starting with the introduction to the EEF. This was, of course, before my time as CEO. Actually, back in 2011, there was no CEO. 2 different charities, the Sutton Trust and Impetus PEP, as I think they were called back then, came together to bid for the government's tender to take hold of this endowment, this 125 million that was being shared by the government at the time, in order to create a What Works Centre for Education. The context for that was that, you know, you've got this really long-standing, as you know, gap for socioeconomic attainment in the education system. Now, again, many people here, Steve, but many of you as well, will know that if you looked at education in the 60s and 70s, you'd have found possibly actually an even bigger gap for attainment according to social class and socioeconomic background than we have now. So this is very, very long-standing in the English education system. I guess there's a couple of interesting points to remark about that. I mean, one is that although right across the OECD you see this very profound gap for social background, nevertheless there is a particularly tight correlation between family wealth and educational outcomes in the UK case. But also, it's really interesting that the government takes this seriously and wants to do something about it. We can all debate how they go about that, of course, but the fact that they're interested in it, and that's been actually quite a recent phenomenon. This isn't sort of part of my academic specialism, but in my political memory, it was towards the end of the New Labour government that we turned, actually with a lot of feminists like myself, saying, look, the gender gap is tiny compared to the social class gap. Why aren't you looking at social class? And eventually, New Labour came round to real commitment to looking at that gap for attainment, and that was taken on then by the coalition governments and the present government in turn, probably governments, if I can say it in that way. We've had so many changes in administration in the meantime. But at the same time, back in 2011, you had this concern about the long-standing gap, but you also had the sudden move to a high autonomy education system. You'll remember that it was back in 2011 that academies or schools then graded outstanding were allowed to select and elect themselves to become academies, and you had that massive scale up of academisation in the system. Alongside new arrangements for schools to spend money on the socially disadvantaged pupils generated by the category Ever FSM, called the pupil premium, but very little rigorous research evidence around how to spend that money. And that's kind of surprising to us, I think, thinking about, academically thinking about the volume of our work. It's not that education research wasn't going on, but actually, again, if you think about it, a hell of a lot of that work wasn't focused on classroom practice. So in terms of being able to tell your average classroom teacher about effective practice, we had relatively little to say to them at that time. And of course, that which we were producing tended to be locked behind paywalls in academic journals and so forth that are completely inaccessible to the average classroom teacher. So then, perhaps not surprisingly, as a consequence to all of that, there was no research use in the classroom. So that was really the context for the creation of the Education Endowment Foundation. And I think at the time it would have been fair to say that it was seen as a bit of a disruptor in the system as well. You know, you had the Gove era at the Department for Education really trying to shake things up, challenge what he saw as the blob and the old establishment in education. And I think that the EEF was sort of seen as part of that disruptive infrastructure. We've changed a lot over time, and again, that's sort of part of the point of my talk today, I think. We characterise ourselves as working in this threefold way. First of all, we synthesise robust research across the globe, drawing it together through synthesis, primarily through our famous Teaching and Learning Toolkit. I think most of you will be familiar with this. There's lots of nods, so I won't bore you too much. If you haven't had a chance to look at this, just Google EEF Toolkit, and this is what will come up. Classically, you know, we've got about 30 different areas of educational practice, and then you've got this very quick, easy to access set of messages around each area for busy teachers and leaders. But what's changed about the toolkit since its relaunch two and a half years ago now is that whereas, you know, those superficial messages used to be kind of it, these days, if you press, you know, you click on any of these icons, you get the depth of evidence, research, dilemmas, and so forth that sit behind these rather bold messages about price, research security, and then pupil progress. Sorry, I'm needing to go backwards now. But that's our synthesis. Then we have our research generation, which is where we commission our own research, primarily through randomized controlled trials and quasi-experimental design, but not exclusively, as I'll explain. Very much focused on either modes of practice which will have the best chance of narrowing gaps in the classroom or addressing sort of really key glaring gaps in the existing educational literature. And then finally, we mobilise that evidence through the education system. And I'll say a little bit more about that, the mobilisation in a second. So in terms of our Impact, again, this is rather bold set of messages, but I think it does speak a lot to the reach that the EEF has had in the intervening decade or so. So you know how many schools there are in the system. It's around 24,000, right? So you can see how many educational institutions in England have worked with us. I think that this is absolutely sort of dazzling and an amazing tribute to the system, really. Anyone who's been involved in one of our trials knows how much work that is and how much administration goes on for a school to be able to support participation in one of our trials. So it's a real collective effort, and that's a message that you'll hear me say frequently. Just over 2 million kids involved in our trials and so forth. During the key years coming out of pandemic, 9 in 10 schools tell the DfE that they're using our resources to inform their recovery work. I can tell you that that was a lot more than we're using the DfE materials, so we were really pleased with that. I've already referred to the 7 in 10 head teachers that say that they use the toolkit to inform their spending and their decisions about resource spend in their schools. Again, you can see the volume of downloads we have annually. This refers to our research school network, which I'll explain about a little bit around in a second. And again, you may not be that familiar with our international work. Of course, our endowed work all happens within England, not even the UK, England. But we have philanthropic funding that enables us to work with countries outside England, including Scotland and Wales, but also more broadly. And it's very gratifying that some other countries, most notably the Netherlands, but also Belgium and Australia, have used the EEF model and set up their own versions of the EEF in those countries. So I think a kind of key message here is not just kind of showing off, although I and of course colleagues at the EEF do feel proud of our reach, but it's also really to say, I think that this, having achieved this reach and scale, this is a terrific way for academics who are involved with us to achieve impact. And I guess that's a point that I will be returning to. So just drawing us up to the present in regard to this background, I mentioned the 125 million originally in the first endowment from government. Last summer, not the one just gone, but the one before that, we were re-endowed. I can tell you that didn't happen just on its own. There was a hell of a lot of work over 2.5 years that went into that, but that sets us up in our contract for at least the next decade. Theoretically, that spend down is between 10 and 15 years. And actually, unlike the first decade that took us to 2022, there is a formal review point that is built in with the intention, all being well, fingers crossed, for refunding. We are now articulated as the kind of the evidence guardian for the English education system. So this is a kind of developmental work. You can see it's not guaranteed over the next decade, but we would like to think that we'll still be around in 30, 50 years' time. Some of you will have seen, we've just secured another 40 million to support activity in post-16. We, from the very start, were mandated to work with 3 to 18-year-olds. But through the re-endowment process and due to our advocacy about the importance both of early years and the impact of early years education, plus where kids from disadvantaged backgrounds most end up in further education, it was really important to be able to extend to those different ends of the spectrum. So we now work with age 2 to 19, which enables us to work more effectively in the post-16 space. And we'll be getting this money in the new financial year, and you'll see us doing more work in that area. So any of you who are interested in post-16 or have any colleagues who are, That's a key message. I won't spend long on the next bullet point. I mean, just to say that we have more than that. I'm focused on our English work, of course, yeah. And just to then illustrate how that money is sort of distributed, we're spending about £27 million a year generally on commissioning education activity, of which 17 million is the research, programmatic and evaluative work, which most academics are engaged with. And you can see the kind of how that breaks down in that final bullet there. If you have any questions about this, I'm really happy to answer them at the end. So, what have we learned? This won't come as a shock to any of you, obviously, but I think interestingly it was a slight surprise to those disruptors early on in the EEF, that actually if you simply gather research together and put it on a website or tell people in a sort of light touch way, this is what the research says, it doesn't make much difference in the classroom. The Literacy Octopus was a multi-arm RCT that was undertaken, I think I'm right to say, sort of around 2016. Obviously, it's published then in 2019, looking at a whole raft of different ways to basically disseminate research in quite a light touch way. And sure enough, none of these approaches made any impact on attainment whatsoever. There's something there about proximity as well, proximity to what's being measured, and I think that's also been a learning for us along the way. But the main takeaway was that we needed a much more profound strategic approach to mobilisation. This is something that really interests me in the sort of portfolio latter part of my career that Steve was mentioning. I have been really involved and interested in policy making, as well as the RSA work. I was also standing advisor to the Parliamentary Select Committee for a while, and just fascinated by these different ways of working and the interface with government. So since my arrival, we've kind of articulated our fourfold approach to mobilisation, characterised here. First of all, our accessible resources, of course, that would include the toolkit and our sort of standing suite of guidance reports for different key areas of education and across the system. But I hope that when you look at those, you'll see them always getting more engaging, always a bit more nuanced, from a practitioner point of view, always more focused on what this would look like in the classroom and how you would translate it into the classroom. And each time we launch something, like a key report, or there'll be a whole suite of different resources, templates, animations, etc., that go hand in hand with that for the sake of classroom practitioners. Then we have our communities of practice, our regional approach. We have regional leads employed across the country in England, working with local stakeholders to drive campaigns and so forth around evidence, often local authorities involved there. And they work in turn with our research school network. You can see the dots across the country, and there's about 40 research schools who are all working in a hub and spokes approach with their own local schools and focused primarily on schools with high volumes of pupil premium kids, but those schools that aren't actually managing to support significant progress with those kids. So there's quite a targeted approach, as well as they're supporting kind of evidence dissemination across their local areas. Evidence guardianship, I referred to earlier, that's really just the kind of shorthand for our policy work. We work with both national government, but also local government across the country in a whole range of different ways, actually. Primarily, our focus is supporting pupil premium and pupil premium spend. They're our pivot team at the DFE. but also, some of you will be familiar that we're curating the evidence frameworks behind the Teacher Career Life Course work, the Early Careers Framework, the MBQs, more probably controversially, the ITT Core Content Framework, and so on. So again, the reason that we do that is because, of course, as you know, the evidence that teaching quality is the most important thing in terms of young people's progress and outcomes, and that's particularly true for kids from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. So for us, it's absolutely pivotal to be supporting quality in the profession. And then finally, our scale-up activity. Two examples there. Nuffield's early language intervention. I'm looking here at Charles and Maggie as well. It is a perfect example, I think, and I'll come on to this story in greater depth in a second. But in terms of being able to take trial programs, test the evidence, and then in the relatively unusual circumstances that we're really confident about the evidence behind a set of practices, be able to advocate for its scale nationally into the system. The National Tutoring Programme is another example that we've been involved with, which doesn't draw from a single programme, but rather from a set of approaches which are well evidenced. Both of these were, of course, sort of scaled during the COVID recovery period. We're probably still, I shouldn't call it a period, we're still recovering from COVID, but you know what I mean. But of course, we have lots of other examples, and in fact, our accelerator funding gives us the possibility to take programmes that have come through our pipeline, shown to be well evidenced, and then we can try to make them available to schools that wouldn't usually be able to access these. Coming back to my lessons, there are 7 of these. We're on number 2. I'll try and whiz through. Robust and independent evaluation of high potential programmes isn't just possible, but it's essential. And just on the right-hand side of the screen there, I've just got a scatter of different exemplars of different programmes with different months' progress or lack of progress thereof. And although we're trying to get a lot more targeted in what we test and trial now, back in the early days of the EEF, I do think that they did an amazing job, actually, of their sort of thousand flowers bloom approach. Bring us your programmes that you claim will have impact on kids' attainment, we'll test them, and actually showing that a hell of a lot of these didn't have evidence for strong impact. Given how precious schools' resources are, I think those messages are very important, as well as, of course, being able to target resource on things that do have good evidence behind them. Oh, we're going backwards, sorry. An expert tapping. The third lesson, I'm going to draw on the case of Nellie. I take it everyone in the room knows about Nuffield's early language intervention. It must be a sort of precious prize for the department. And Charles, of course, would be able to outline this much better than I would. This slide reflects the efficacy trial undertaken, as you can see, by colleagues at University College London for the evaluation and the finding of the 4 months progress delivered there. And then we're beginning to tell the story of the scale-up. This slide tells the full story. So you can see, again, I don't know, Charles, whether you wanted to even say something about this, or I can do I'll have a go and you can correct me when I'm wrong. The early days obviously funded by the Nuffield Foundation, hence Nuffield Early Language Intervention. Nuffield have a relationship with us where they undertake kind of feasibility work on really promising, well-evidenced programmatic work. And then if this seems plausible, well-evidenced and trialable, they actually give us a nudge and say, look, can we put this into your pipeline? Which is exactly what happened. Nellie came through efficacy trial, as I said. and then through effectiveness trial, and you can see the difference between, the numbers of schools and kids involved at each turn, and then, again, highly unusually, but on the basis of the government's nationalisation during its recovery work, we were able to further test the impact of Nellie on, working in 11,000 schools, and still, amazingly and hugely gratifyingly, found that additional month's progress, and that was particularly the case. It was particularly effective for kids from socially disadvantaged backgrounds. And I'm told by my head of synthesis, John Kay, that this makes Nellie one of the 3 best evidence programmes anywhere in the world. So that's a huge tribute to the team involved. When we think about the impact that that's making in the English education system, it's really profound, and I think that we all feel very proud to be associated with it. Lesson 4, evidence and professional expertise are complementary. So I've already mentioned, how we do see this as we're working in partnership with education professionals. But I think that's something that the EEF has learned across its sort of decade-long journey, is that mainly that sort of second bullet point, basically. Without implementation, it's going nowhere. It's not enough just to have something that's well evidenced, or if it's not done right in the classroom, or the key ingredients are missing, it's not going to have impact. And that's become more and more evident as time has gone on, and often really well illustrated by our progress reviews within our, our IPUs that sit alongside our trial work. I think that 4th bullet point is also very important, that without capacity in the system, we're also going nowhere. We know how stretched the system is. We know, of course, about the teacher recruitment and retention crisis. We know about the issues about funding, about buildings and so forth. Ultimately, you need the basics to be in place to be able to fulfill this good in implementation. So all of these ingredients are really important. The 5th lesson is really about the kind of consistency and transparency you need to build credibility and ensure trust. It has been fascinating to me. I was really aware of this, of course, working at the RSA, where all sorts of what I would consider to be snake oil would become to try to plead that we would advocate for them and so forth, always claiming to be evidence-led and so forth. And really, the education system is awash with this stuff. Also, edu gurus, authors of books, authors of consultancy packages and so forth. I think basically the being able to tell a story that resonates with practitioners can have a very strong impact. And as I've said already, the sort of trope about everything being evidence informed is really, really strong now. If you look at almost every product, they're claiming to be evidence informed. So how do we differentiate, and how do we give practitioners the confidence that they will actually be able to trust our work? As I said, transparency is absolutely key to that. We put everything on the website. And also, I guess, the little icon on the right-hand side, which is drawn for, it's an illustrative picture of confidence intervals that could be taken from any one of our syntheses that sit behind the toolkit. The point about the outlier studies is really key. I think this is why practitioners often get mixed messages about research, or, well, research doesn't tell us anything because you can always find one answer and then somebody tells you the opposite and so forth. Actually, this is the power of meta-analysis, really, that you can have confidence. If you've got, 30 studies and 2 are outliers, you'll be able to say, mention that nuance, which of course is important, but nevertheless, you'll have confidence in the findings of the 28. So not cherry-picking evidence. I guess, is the important message. Lesson 6, again, I think this is a familiar theme, really. So it's not just what works, but it's how, where. Context is important. I've said implementation is important. Being able to dig in and get the nuance behind the findings. I think that's really good security, both for practitioners, but also, of course, for academics. And this, the picture on the right-hand side is just an illustrator of the greater nuance that you get if you click through the toolkit. So yeah, I've already mentioned our process evaluations that couple with every quantitative trial, you know, with the evaluation for each trial. We have run, I think, since about 2018, always a process evaluation that takes a qualitative, often we're coupled with a survey-based approach, to be checking the feedback, understanding fidelity, etc., and often why something didn't work, as well as why perhaps something did. And the 7th lesson is one that I've mentioned already, that this is a collective effort, that actually school teachers are really keen to be part of this evidence-led movement. They're very enthusiastic about it, very engaged. I know I'm generalising, of course. I'm not saying that every teacher is really enthused by this, but the uptake and the buy-in that we've had has been truly phenomenal, I think. So that's a wonderful message to take away. I guess from this point and slide, I want then to be able to take this and move to the partnership with academics. We're partnered with teaching professionals. How do we work with academics, which is the basis of the next section of the talk. So, start with Oxford University, we work very effectively, I would say, as this slide illustrates. So I'll let you have a look at that. I'm aware that, well, let me ask you, you probably don't count Oxford University Press as sort of part of you, do you, or do you?
I do, yeah.
You do? Oh, okay. Oh, okay, so enthusiastic, yeah, okay. That's really interesting. I sort of guessed that you would think that there's sort of something different somewhere else.
They fund research.
Yeah, so that's, okay. Okay, no, that's really good then. So we're right to total it up all together. That's a really good takeaway for me. And what about Oxford University Innovation? That's presumably your enterprise kind of piece as well.
Yes, it's the spin out part of the university.
Yeah, so you would definitely see this as all rightly bundled together. Good. And I don't know what St John's College are doing, that they had that section.
How very cheap.
Yeah, was that the whole programme? That's brilliant. I love that. Okay, good. Well, in that case, we've accurately then bundled it together at over 16 million quid. And that's certainly a good whack over £1 million a year for every year that the EEF has existed. And as I'll show you in a minute, you are probably our most successful collaboration, at least in terms of pound signs. So this, I think, is tells a wonderful story. There's lots of reasons for this. One of which is, of course, the programmatic work, which, very, very roughly characterised. We're doing a lot of every trial that we run. We're subsidising the programme that's being trialled, and then we're running an evaluation around it, the randomised control trial. And actually, the subsidy for the programmatic work tends to cost a hell of a lot more than the evaluation, more than double actually. So, in sitting in the figures here, of course, you've got Nelly, but also other programmatic work that you've been collectively involved with, as well as some evaluation work. And again, I'll be interested to hear from you about to what extent this is known, how reliant the EEF is on working with academics, and then how actually academic work underpins and comprises the mainstay, really, of the work we do. So I've got a list of examples, but they're really top of head from me, and there'll be many other examples as well. So we have our expert advisory group for the evaluation. Am I getting that wrong, Jake? It's the evaluation.
That's right.
Okay, good. That's completely populated by academics and real experts in the trials and experimentation field. You'll all be aware that the toolkit was originally constructed by Steve Higgins and his colleagues at Durham University, alongside, first of all, Sutton Trust and then EEF colleagues, and we still work collaboratively on developing that to this day, along with UCL colleagues in the Epicentre, who have designed and developed all of the kind of synthesis infrastructure that sits around that. So that's a really long-standing partnership. All of our kind of key resources, our guidance reports and so forth, all have expert groups sitting around them, which tend to include both classroom teachers to make sure that the evidence is being made, properly, effectively brought to life for classroom practice, but also specialist subject experts with academic backgrounds. Then, of course, the mainstay, the ongoing involvement in both developing and providing programmes to be trialled, but also then, as I've said, evaluating and conducting those trials, so both the programmatic and the evaluation work. Commission scoping and research and review work, we're doing more and more of this because we want to be more and more sort of targeted and topics-based approach with our basically trying to secure impact in regard to the work that we're commissioning. How can we drive harder and faster on trying to narrow the socioeconomic gap for attainment? We're trying to do more and more kind of scoping work to make sure we're drawing on the existing evidence to direct our commissioning in the right direction. And that's involving, literature reviews, practice reviews, and so on, all of which are commissioned out, but a much more sort of qualitative and mixed methods than our trials work. And finally, engagement in academic and methodological debates. Our teams, particularly the evaluation team, I mean, some of them have been academics, most of them have doctorates, and they are methodological innovators themselves, but they love the chance to be able to talk and debate with academic experts in the field as well. And I would love to see us as having that sort of genuinely engaged conversation. EEF colleagues have sort of published their own work and so on. But it's, I think, creating real innovation, actually, certainly for the UK. But I guess I've got a set of hypotheses that I'll show you in a second. And the kind of top line title, if you like, for my hypotheses is it just a narrow segment? That's with a question mark, I think. Obviously, our work is relatively specialised, and obviously it's driven on a particular focus and mission. But what I noticed immediately, as an academic arriving into the EEF, is that when we talk about our sort of, people that we're constantly engaged with, when we're giving out our funding and our commissioning and so forth, you hear a lot of the non-academic organisations resounding, particularly on the evaluation side. So I asked to have this list drawn up, ready for this talk, because I was interested as well. So this is our top commissioned out organisations, and you can see proudly Oxford there at the top by some way as well. But next, interestingly, NFER, and bear in mind that NFER don't do programmatic work. Their work is almost exclusively evaluations for us. Then we've got UCL, who probably, like you, will be doing a mixture of different things. My tutor is a bit of an odd one. They had done programmatic work that's been tested with us prior to the National Tutoring Programme, and then were in the National Tutoring Programme as well, which probably explains why they're on the list. But then you've got National Centre for Social Research, York, Durham and Queen's are all there. You'll notice that if you think about those universities on the list, they've all got quite long-standing quants expertise, which I think again tells, it's quite intuitive, tells that story. But you can see again lower on the list, you've got FFT, you've got behavioural insights. I would hypothesize that RAND probably sits somewhere like this. And if I was to disaggregate that table, we'd find that, if I was to look at evaluations separately to programmatic work, you'd probably see quite a movement. So I guess my main point is that I think universities could be doing even more to harness the opportunity that EEF funding represents. So then on to my hypotheses. How am I doing for time? I'm just lagging a little bit. I'll try and speed up a little bit. This is the getting into the discussion piece, really. And I've got 3 suggestions here. I think there's still some sort of prevalent myths about the EEF and the extent of knowledge about the opportunity. I think that there may be some ways that EEF practices are not felt to be conducive to academic ways of working, and I'd love your feedback on that point. And then thirdly, academic organisational conditions aren't conducive to maximising the opportunity that we represent. So I'll go through those very, very quickly. First of all, these myths, have a look at these and you'll be able to decide to what extent you think that these are a representation of discussions in academia or not.
I've certainly heard all those said.
There you are then, that's good. You could start the discussion. I won't kind of go extra sort of try to myth bust now. Maybe we can in the discussion. Needless to say, I would say on each of these bullets that this isn't the case, we do broader work, etc., etc. In terms of our practices perhaps being less conducive to academic ways of working, again, this is where I'm really particularly interested to hear from you, because if there's anything blocking, sort of almost inverted commas accidentally, these are things that I can possibly do something about. So again, this is just an idea from me, really. Because we insist on publishing our outcome measure findings from randomised controlled trials immediately on our website to make sure that there's no lag for teachers, which there would be if you went through academic journals, I imagine that can cause frustration in relation to kind of publicising key findings through traditional academic routes. And I know the value, of course, of peer-reviewed journal articles for an academic career. Both, I think Charles and I would both say, and I'm sure other people in the room as well, you can get loads of publications out of your EEF funded work. I certainly did before I joined the EEF. But nevertheless, I imagine that this might be a point of some tension. Obviously, we are pretty directive in what we're funding, and so there's less space for that kind of blue skies approach that I know obviously academics tend to love. I don't know if there's something about overheads, but that certainly in my last job, we used to try to advocate to the EEF to put up their overheads. They never did. But I imagine there are other things as well, so that you can come back to me on. And then in terms of, the other side of the coin, really, when I showed you that sort of top 10 list, I said that the organisations that are academic organisations on it all have a history of quantitative work and sort of strength in that area. It certainly seems to me that the growth in quantitative work still remains both somewhat limited across universities more widely, and that there is a lack of depth to that pool. So all the time we find that there'll be a list of sort of key academics that are kind of our go-to people, but when we're about to set a tender, we'll notify, everyone on our panel, and academics basically get full up, oh, well, I'm already doing 2 of your evaluations, so I can't do any more. It's like, well, where's the centre that's sitting behind you? Where's your team of doctoral students? Why aren't departments investing to enable us to take advantage of the opportunity, rather than a sort of cap being existing there? And certainly, so for me as a sort of ex-university leader, thinking about that strategic approach to maximising the opportunity is one that I would want to encourage, I think. Certainly because, in contrast, I would say, and this is not just a learning from my time at the EEF, but long before that, other organisations are much sharper elbowed and much more sort of forceful and forthcoming in having the conversation. What's the next thing on your list? What do we need to be preparing for now, for next year, etc., etc. I imagine, again, I'll be interested to hear from you, that the kind of paradigm wars, they're demon positivists, or, can make this uncomfortable for people to engage in some university contexts. I don't think that this would be true of Oxford, but knowing how sort of profoundly and passionately some people feel about some of that, I can imagine that in some departments, in some universities, that makes it a bit anxious for you to be the person that's playing with the EEF or whatever. And then I think this one's important, thinking about, are there incentivizations for academics not to be developing programmatic work? We've often found that academic teams are brilliant at creating trialable propositions that have this prospect of narrowing gaps and so forth, and actually that those tend to be, I would say, particularly effective across our trials, because there's, of course, robust evidence sitting behind them. But then when it comes to taking them to scale up, it's kind of like, well, who's going to do it? Because it's not part of your average academic career to be taking on these programs, thinking about how you're going to market them, etc., etc. But actually, I would say, in terms of impact and in terms of actually making a difference to kids' lives, it's really important that those things don't just get left on the shelf, as academics move on to the next thing. So thinking again strategically about how to facilitate that might be generative, I think. And I'm sure there'll be other ideas there. I'll be very, very quick because I'm mindful of the time on strategic development. I've covered most of this already along the way, actually. We stay determinedly mission focused, and that will remain, and in fact definitely intensify. I've already mentioned several times that we've become a lot more focused on, come on, we're spending this public money, how are we going to make sure that we're investing on things that have a genuine proposition at narrowing gaps, rather than the kind of broader thousand flowers blooming approach that was present at the EEF's foundation. So these are the things that we're working forward. First of all, as I say, this focus, which involves a rigorous dive into the theory of change underpinning programmatic work, rather than, as I say, we'll trial. You're claiming we'll trial. Instead, we now want to see the evidence that there's a likely prospect and a reason that you would expect to be impacting the gap, rather than just assuming. And a focus on relevant topics. So you see that our commission programmes are becoming more focused on topic areas now. I've talked about our extension into the early years and post-16. Again, those are, I think, long-term now opportunities for partnership work. We want to, importantly, harvest as much knowledge as possible from our work. and disseminate that effectively. So not simply just, bunging evaluation results up on our website and sort of seeing what happens. We've actually got enough knowledge now around areas like, Key Stage 1 literacy or Key Stage 2 numeracy and so forth, that we can be actually drawing that work together, harvesting the key messages to put out to the teaching profession, but also thinking about the key ingredients within those. We can't have a situation, I'll come on to my next slide. We can't have a situation where the education system is simply comprised of a jigsaw of effective programs. That genuinely would be deprofessionalizing. We want to actually be able to distill messages from what has been effective across those programs, so that if we've got a suite, as actually we have a suite of literacy programs that have been proven effective across primary education, what were the core components of those programs that make them effective? What can the average classroom teacher learn from that in regard to their pedagogy? Or what can the average school leader take from their ongoing commissioning, rather than relying on a single program? So these are some of the efforts that we want to undertake. In order to facilitate this approach, we're going to need different methodologies. We're very committed to the ongoing sort of RCT as the kind of baseline of our work, but I think you've seen throughout my talk that a reliance on mixed methods approaches is also very, very welcome and bought into actually by the entire EEF team. We're very keen to moving just from a sort of singular focus on programs. We want to be able to test wider approaches. We have two suites of strands of work, I would call them, around quasi-experimental design. One is called Teacher Choices, which is based on teachers testing different approaches that they would use in the classroom day to day. And the other is School Choices, based on the sort of choices that a school leader might have to take. And that might be, am I applying mixed attainment grouping or streaming across my school? Am I doing a 3-year GCSE preparation or a 2-year? Those kind of larger scale decisions that actually have a really profound effect, as we know, on the gap. So being able to test those approaches, you can't do that in a randomised controlled trial way mostly. We need different ways to approach that. So I think that the conversation here with academia is really important, and actually together, working collaboratively, we really can innovate in a really world-leading way. I flicked that at you tantalisingly, so I'll just explain what it is. I've talked about our extension into early years and post-16. Just for those of you who don't know I can see Kathy at the back, and of course she's very familiar with these things, and then gratifyingly told me they're going down well, which is lovely to hear. But this is our early years toolkit, which has been relaunched, and our early years evidence store, which basically is a whole suite of materials, videos, exemplification for childminders and early years practitioners around what the evidence can look like in practice. So again, I guess taking us right to the end, I'm exemplifying the importance of mobilisation for our impact, how we're working ever harder and faster on trying to attain that impact, and how we see that absolutely as a collaboration, not just with classroom teachers, but as you as academics. And I'm looking forward to hearing your feedback on what I've said. Thank you.